Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 71st episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. So I teased this episode unintentionally in the fourth episode we did on coronavirus because Matt sent me a text on sort of well, just to recap, if you didn't see that episode, it was contrasting between Biden's coronavirus policies and um, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, his his coronavirus policy. Excuse me, if I said foreign policies, I meant coronavirus policies. And so that got Matt thinking about sort of how politicians operate, how should they operate, and how would he operate, or how would I operate if we were in a position of power. So we're going to just have a conversation really about that, kind of our views of law, or our views of how politicians interact with law, and how they can or how they interact with precedent, and what we think is how we think in terms of when a politician can buck precedent, or if they can buck law or anything. Just the nitty gritty of getting your kind of policies passed in in the government, in a government setting. And I think I remember what I said, so I'll just say that here again. I said that my rule is you can buck precedent, but you can't buck law. So in other words, you can't, if there's a law that you don't like, that you think should be changed or gotten rid of so you can do something else, then you have to work to change that law. You have to go through the system, go through all the proper channels, and so you can legally do whatever it is you want to do. But then when it comes to precedent, I think that there's much more wiggle room in that arena because, because it's not illegal, because no one can make an argument about I'm going to take this to court and you're going down. All you're really doing is, well, people haven't done that before. So it's like when we had the argument about a while back about packing the courts, whether the Democrats should pack the courts or not. There's nothing legally that tells you, well, Republicans or Democrats, there's nothing legally that says either party cannot pack the courts, right? It's just they haven't packed the courts because there's always been a certain number of Supreme Court justices. Now, in terms of I think it was, in Biden's case, it was the eviction moratorium. He was like, I'm just gonna keep this eviction moratorium, even though the Supreme Court said, okay, you gotta change the law, buddy. You can't just keep doing this. They upheld the moratorium for a while because people thought it was necessary due to COVID. But they made it clear to the Democrats and to Biden that, well, no, you can't keep this up forever because you're going against the books. And you can't do that as a sitting president, or you can't do that as president. So I think that's a good place to begin the conversation. I'll let you give your opening thoughts.
Yeah. So you've already kind of hinted at, I think, where the main disagreement between us is going to be in the episode. So I think a lot of my point, or my root argument, would be it comes down to political expediency, but I use that in a very, I guess, more narrow way than people would expect. So when you think of political expediency, you might think of a Democrat packing the courts tomorrow, because then they'd have a majority in the Supreme Court. But I think this is the same way that people, I think, wrongly interpret self-interest, or Ayn Rand's version of selfishness. So people assume selfishness means you can't selfishly be compassionate, but it's good for your own well-being for people you love to do well, right? So to some degree, it can be selfish to help the people you care about. That's the same way I'm kind of arguing for political expediency. Is the time horizon is important, and you have to characterize long-term, short-term, midterm. So I guess the way that I kind of don't have any reverence for the law, and I actually don't think anybody has any reverence for the law that's in power. That's just my assessment of things. I think I've given more time to hearing Supreme Court kind of rulings and breakdowns on that than like the layman has. And if I've learned anything from that, it's that the law is very I don't want to say arbitrary, but like, you know, so Congress and the House, they put a law together and the president signs into law and whatnot, but it has to get interpreted by the Supreme Court. And a lot of times, the way the Supreme Court chooses to interpret laws seems pretty ridiculous. So, does the piece of paper law matter, or does the Supreme Court's interpretation of law matter? Well, in practice, the Supreme Court's interpretation of the law is what prevails. And I think the Supreme Court's interpretation of law can be pretty wishy-washy depending on how they're feeling. Like if you ask lawyers how they feel about precedent, you'll hear all sorts of things about legal precedent. You'll hear some people who say the Supreme Court should just overturn it, or you'll hear the Supreme Court should overturn it if they have a very good reason. But all these things are like a very open scale about how much they value an issue and how much they care about the policy and how impactful they think it is. So I really think political actors should not hold the law like it's anything more than a vague idea. Um, and the other thing I'd like throw in is just in general, like we know the law isn't equally enforced. And I don't mean that in a discriminatory way. I mean it in the sense that like certain people get, 10 charges thrown at them because somebody's out to get them. And other people will do things that are illegal all the time and get like a smaller fine. Even like jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the same law can have like vastly different penalties. It's really arbitrary in a way that I don't think can hold any sanctity. So I don't think it should be treated as such. So things like Ron DeSantis saying he's essentially violating certain levels of power in government. So he's saying, I'm the governor. I'm going to make it illegal for certain counties or certain school districts to have a certain policy by withholding funds. Somebody can say, I'm upset by that because the law says he's not allowed to do that. And I would essentially say, if I'm in favor of what he's doing and I don't think it has long-term negative consequences for other ideas I champion, then I should be in favor of it anyways. Um, the last qualification I'll make is bring up the filibuster. And I think this really is illustrative of kind of why I want to talk about this too. You'll hear everybody has flip flopped on if the filibuster should be eliminated or not. Everybody said it should be. Everybody said it shouldn't be. Every time when they get in front of a microphone or the press and say why, they make a principled case, even though we all know they're doing it, saying that for a practical reason. But what I would say is you should really think of it as I need a practical reason to get rid of it, and it needs to be long term. So this is the whole thing where the Democrats got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court justices, and then but Trump became president, and then he got 3 Supreme Court justices. So it's kind of like, is it good to get rid of it, even though it seems good in the moment? Because you need to care more about long term consequences. So I think if you are going to operate in the Machiavellian world, be Machiavellian, but acknowledge long time horizons. And I don't see why there's any reason to give a bonus to the law in terms of I will not violate this. Because your opponents, if they want something that you don't want bad enough, they generally will violate it or they'll interpret it in a different way and then get that as the prevailing wisdom. So I just don't see why you should play by rules and restrict yourself, if that makes sense.
I mean, so as usual, there's points of agreement and points of disagreement. I mean, I think it's sort of the nature of the law to be general, somewhat arbitrary, and varying interpretations. I mean, because like, I mean, if you so it's like law in the if you look at like I don't know, Plato's Republic. He just does something like he doesn't really write the way law is written because he's like very specific about like crazy rules that like don't really make any sense. Although maybe they made sense when he wrote them, but it's like they're so specific that it just kind of boggles your mind. But that's like not how law is ever written. Law is generally not written in a very specific fashion. Law is written in the most general fashion possible. And I just think that's the nature of the law. And I think that would be nature of public law, or that would be the nature of private law. So there's that. Um, And then I actually agree with you about I don't have a reverence, quote unquote, for the law. Really, I mean, uh, but I suppose I do support the rule of law. I just don't support the rule of law for the idea that the law is perfect and we should never question the law, and we should never break the law. I mean, in Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, I mean he's kind of taking on this uh, uh, it's like, say, Socrates' argument in I think is it the Apology? No, it's Crito. I think Crito is the dialogue that represents Socrates' death, and Socrates is basically like, well, I'm a citizen of Athens, and so I need to follow the laws, and laws decree that I need to be put to death. So if I don't accept being put to death as the Athenian citizen, then a murderer can run away from Athens and not be put to death. Blah 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 blah. And Dr. King is saying like, no, that's an absurd assertion. That's an assertion which leads you down leads you down paths that most people would find unacceptable. I mean, I'm all for civil disobedience. I'm all for breaking the law when there's another point you're trying to make. So it's like when the civil rights activists were doing sit-ins and diners and cafes because they were segregated diners and cafes, and then they got arrested. It's like, well, they were breaking the law, right? But that they're making the broader point. They were making the broader point that you shouldn't have segregation in diners and cafes or anywhere. But at the same time, I think you have to, when you're a politician, I think you have to be very careful when you're kind of skirting the law a bit. I mean, I think most politicians do behave in a very Machiavellian fashion, or most rulers behave in a very Machiavellian fashion, and that's just the nature of history. That's the nature of people. I accept that. I mean, I don't accept it. I accept it as a fact of life, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I think it's very easy to take someone down when they're clearly trying to do something politically which is explicitly prohibited in the law books. And when you're not, doing something that's explicitly prohibited but can still get you towards your goal, it might be in your interest to not break the law, but to break precedent. Because you don't want to give your critics the ammunition of that guy's breaking the law. Let's arrest him. Let's take him down. That policy is illegal or something. But it's a fine line you have to walk. Politicians generally don't engage in civil disobedience, of course. So it's sort of a question of like how the politicians deal with the law versus how citizens like Dr. King deal with the law.
I think we agree more than we disagree, to at least some extent. An example I think I'd use to maybe bolster my case on against the part that I think maybe you're less sympathetic to, or maybe you're just viewing this maybe in a literal way that maybe I could clarify. Obamacare. I'm not a fan, but I'm going to tell you about what I think is one of the most, I guess, impressive things about it. So Obamacare is essentially a too big to fail version of government policy. It has arguable constitutionality in a lot of ways, but they passed it and it's huge. They implemented it and it affects a ton of people's healthcare or healthcare and health insurance, right? So it has drastic consequences if it becomes undone. A pivotal element of the Affordable Care Act is the individual mandate, right? So the individual mandate was pretty much saying if you decide not to get insurance and you're uninsured, you're going to face a penalty, a financial penalty. So, okay, that exists, but in the way that the law is created, that contradicts other laws and was argued to be unconstitutional. That gets in front of the Supreme Court. And because even though there was a 5-4 Republican majority, the squishy Republican voted with the Democrats because he was essentially saying the fine is a tax, so you're allowed to tax them. Even you're not allowed to fine them for this reason, but you are allowed to tax them. So we're just going to call that fine a tax, and now we don't have to worry about it. It was a very squishy thing, but it was pretty much saying the Democrats kind of ignored the unconstitutionality of a bill that they pushed, and then they kind of hoped it was too big to fail, and they hoped that the people, it's like the game theory of it. It wasn't politically palatable for the Supreme Court to overturn Obamacare at that time on something that's so small, even though that small thing is crucial to the Affordable Care Act, right? So I think that's impressive in the sense of like in a Machiavellian way. They needed this part of the policy. That part of the policy breaks the rules, but they know it has to go to the court system, and they don't think the courts has the guts to overturn it on that small of a thing, even though technically it broke the rules. It wasn't just that they were saying like, no, it didn't break the rules. He was kind of saying, I'm going to help you guys redefine it so it doesn't break the rules. That's kind of how I think political actors that I agree with should act. They if they are being held back by those limitations, but they want to do something, then they should say, hey, if this is going to go to the courts, but the courts aren't going to be willing to overturn it, then we're going to do it anyways because it's going to make people's lives better from my estimation or from the politicians I agree with estimation. And if it gets overturned, it gets overturned, but put the onus on them. That's playing good politics. You're playing offense. And if you're actually doing something that helps people, then you should be okay playing offense because then they have to overturn it and make everybody's lives worse. This is also why the state kind of perpetuates itself. But it also perpetuates itself because the people I like generally aren't willing to do things like this. These are the same people who are usually arguing for the letter of the law of the Constitution. And I think that's really what holds them back from maybe maintaining ground on their rivals. So yeah. So is that type of rule bending the kind of rule bending you're saying is okay or isn't okay?
I think it's the type of rule bending which is inevitable given the nature of law. And so, given that it's inevitable, I think if I were a politician, I would not hesitate to use it. Um, I mean, because there is no end to debates in law. I mean, because there really is nothing exactly to base them on. I mean, I guess what you could. I mean, I remember writing in a paper for an English class. It was about. It was actually. It was contrasting the Crito dialogue versus King's letter. And I said something to the effect of like letter is the extension of morality, but law is the extension of morality, but law is not morality. But in the same way that like politics is endlessly debated, I mean, so is the nature of the law. And that's sort of why people hate law and hate lawyers and judges. And this is why we had a conversation a while back on jury nullification. You know, one of those weird like things that people don't really know what to make of, and people in the profession have very strong opinions on both sides. So it's an endless debate, and you have to accept that and fight for what you think is right on those terms.
I want to push back a little bit. Just I think maybe it's clarification needed on my end. Um, so the abstract big picture nature of law is the legislature makes the law, the legislature disagrees all the time, therefore the law is typically confusing, right? Or it can be interpreted in a lot of ways. A lot of laws aren't confusing. A lot of laws are very straightforward. Um, so if I was to pose a similar example, but the laws are straightforward, because many times they are, right? That might say something like the executive has powers over some has powers over spending. Well, that's not true because Congress has power of the purse. I'm trying to think of some. I'm trying to set up like a really easy example, and it shouldn't be as hard as it is now. Because all the classic simple laws are usually criminal laws. So maybe this goes to your point a little bit about a lot of laws about who has the power to do what are constantly interpreted. But there are laws that will straight up say like you can't like Congress can't pass laws that do blank. Congress will do laws that do blank anyways, and they just kind of hope nobody cares. Like precedent
Could you
backs.
give an example of that, by the way, just so we're
Well, it sucks
I
because
need
I
an
don't want to.
example to better
I don't
clarify.
want to give bad constitutional laws. I mean, okay. Well, there's the famous case of maybe that's not a great example either. I'm hating them killing this much airtime because there is the whole case that went to the Supreme Court that kind of said like, hey, you created hay, and because you could have bought hay instead of farming it yourself, we can regulate it. And this was like an interpretation of the law. So I feel like a lot of what you're saying applies to interpretations of laws that are like when it's about withholding state power, right? So a lot of what you're saying is if somebody says the state can't do something, it's like, well, people are arguing about that. So we should just do that anyways. And if they're going to stop us, they can stop us. That's kind of what I'm hearing from your end. But if like, but if the Republicans passed something that was like that was something along the lines of Congress cannot make laws that interfere with the health industry defined as X, Y, and Z. Democrats get in power. They don't have the votes to repeal that, but they have the votes to just do a law for that industry and clearly overtly violate the letter of the law. I think you would still say they should violate the letter of the law because they're going to do something I like. And I don't care they would need 5 more votes to be able to repeal this thing to then do the thing I want. Just do the thing I want. Screw those people who wrote that literal law that I want broken.
I mean, in the case of something like healthcare, I don't really think that's the path that politicians can take. I mean, they can, but I don't think it's the one that really is going to. I think that's just an example of something that will generally blow up in your face, just because. Well, I mean, for a couple of reasons. One, healthcare is just such a huge issue, and everyone has a stake in it, so to speak. But also, I mean, again, the Supreme Court or even lower courts, I mean, they get involved in laws all the time, and so it our legal system is just so uncoordinated, which is why it's so frustrating sometimes and confusing. But it's like um, there's so many actors involved that it's like, and I'm not trying to necessarily make the cheap checks and balances argument, but something similar does seem to happen in different branches of government and different levels of government, from local, state, federal. Um, there's always someone who's like generally questioning something, or there's someone who like thinks this is unconstitutional, so they take it to court, or so it's like, um, I think the way our system is structured really does prevent politicians from just openly violating laws on major issues. Maybe for minor issues that no one, except very like niche people would ever recognize. Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, like Obamacare. I mean, they really did go through the courts. I mean, they really did their battles. Obama and his, the Democrats in favor of that, they really like went to bat for that within the courts. And I guess I mean, I don't really want to argue about the constitutionality of it, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's really a matter of like legislators don't like this law, so they're going to pass it something anyway, and then they just get away with it because everyone's Machiavellian in politics. It's like it's so much more un that the power is so diffuse in the system that it's like there's always people that are going to be a thorn in your side, and because there are always people that are going to be a thorn in your side, I think for big legislation you have to go the legal way.
Okay. I thought of a good example, and what so the things you just said kind of illustrated why I was having a hard time. And the reason I was having a hard time is, I mean, it's how you love the show. You pretty much kind of sussed out the difference between what you see as precedent and the dialogue and law. And precedent is supposed to be the same thing as the law because it's what the law means in that moment, right? So in my head, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking of, well, precedent will decide that something isn't allowed, and then people will pass something anyways, even though the legal precedent that should be referred to would strike it down. And oftentimes it leads to like immediate court injunctions, in which case I would say, wow, you were a stupid Machiavellian because you should know what courts would immediately put an injunction on this. And if you did that when that could happen, that was a dumb play. You're an idiot. But I think a better example might be talking about certain separation of powers things. So like something like sanctuary cities or sanctuary states, um, or states that are attempting to, I guess, on their level, nullify gun laws, right? So, based on like the federal laws, those states will operate in violation of them because of what the governor or the mayor or like the district attorney in a county decide to do. And I'm okay with that, right? So if I lived in a red state and I had a district attorney who said, "Hey, there's this federal law, I'm not going to enforce it because I don't feel like it." And if federal government wants to come in and enforce it, then we're going to get mad at them. But I don't think they have the guts to step in. Then I think they should just disregard the federal government, even though the law is telling them they should be enforcing something. So how do you feel about that type of, I guess, line of argument?
I mean, so I think an issue we run into in the show, if you're a regular listener, is I don't always give the hard line answers that Matt is looking for, and I'm not unfortunately going to be able to do that in this example he gives, because I think it really depends on the situation, and it really depends on the likelihood of the courts getting involved, and it depends on how how, not how sneaky, but how smart you are in implementing what it is you're trying to implement. I mean, I think
So if you
like,
can get away with it, you should do it.
well, it depends what you'd want to get away with, though, is the thing. I'm not saying I don't think bucking law just to get away with anything is okay. It
Well,
depends on
if
what you're
it's
trying to
something
get
you
away
like
with.
and you can get away with it, then you should do it. That's what I'm saying.
I mean, I don't. Okay, I guess I'm not willing to go that far then, because and here's the thing: like when you defend the rule of law, you seem like an idiot because it's like, oh, rule of law, buddy. Yeah, that's right. Ha 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 ha. This person interpreted the law differently, and they went to and therefore they locked someone up, huh, punk? Like they give you all kinds of crazy examples about why the rule of law is or they think is a stupid, dumb idea, because it doesn't, because of how the messy the law is, as we've been saying, but. I don't think that invalidates the idea that we should be aiming for a society of laws and not men. It just means that it's one of those things which is very hard to get to, and it's something it's a constant struggle which you have to just continue to fight for. So it's like I don't have a. I mean, I only have if I have a reverence for the law, it's only insofar as the law is protecting people's the privileges, I guess, if I can't say rights, that I think people should have. And the law is sort of an extension of that community's values. Um, so it really is. I do see the law as sort of the democratic principle trying to be institutionalized in a weird way. But um, at the same time, as I said, politicians and the nature of power causes people to behave in other ways. Um, so it's that's where that's where it seems like, oh, the rule of law doesn't matter. And I would say no, the rule of law does matter, but there are many people who get into politics who don't think it matters, and you got to fight those people tooth and claw, um, to try to reestablish the ideal or try to reestablish as close to the closest thing to the ideal that you're getting at.
I think I could be sympathetic to that on like an idealistic ground, but I don't think that is a goal worth striving for the same reason why I don't think a limited republic is a goal worth striving for, because I just don't think it's possible. So I think an analogy for what I think the rule of law is compared to kind of what you laid out is I think of it as like a weapons arsenal. So imagine like 100 guns laid out, and the people in power, they manifest their power with how they choose to use law. Now, one of the reasons why I guess I'm being so critical of law and how I'm being so, I guess, critical of how unequally enforced it is because if a district attorney of the opposite party, if they win the election in your city, all of a sudden they'll just choose to not enforce certain laws. Which I mean, I'm usually cool with because I usually don't like laws being enforced for the most part, especially because like if a Democrat gets in charge, if they get power and they don't want to enforce drug laws, like that's cool. I don't think people should be going to prison for that. So it's almost like, okay, I get into power, I remove certain guns from my arsenal. But now I want to crack down on people who I think are avoiding taxes. So now I'm going to use these guns instead, right? So depending on who's in power, you can have an index of 5,000 pages of law, but the ones that people feel like enforcing are the ones that are chosen. The book is never perfectly executed, and it's never by the people in charge, it's never even attempted to be perfectly executed because people know laws are outdated and they make no effort to repeal them. And if something similar or adjacent to that ends up being convenient, they're like, well, I'm glad we still have that on the books because I can get away with this because of what this does. So in practice, I think it's more of an arsenal. And I don't even think that's like a limited to the United States kind of thing. I think that applies to pretty much any government that bothers to have the facade of a rule book to appeal to. But it's, you pick and choose which guns you want to use in that 4-year term, right? So even if you could have a community of men that think that represents the ethic of the community, like that's not what happens. So I don't like that framing because it's like an ideal that never even gets close to being touched and nobody even ever has the goal of getting there. And even if that was the goal, I think I'd still put my partisanship as a bigger priority in front of that.
Um, well, but I mean, I guess what I have to say to that is, then, I mean, if I think, that a politician is violating, my, I guess, interpretation of the rule of law, then I fight against that politician or whatever he or she is doing, whether I'm a politician myself or a citizen. Um, I recognize it's an ideal that I'm appealing to, but I don't think that necessarily invalidates it on the grounds that if law is going to exist, and again, public-private law, I think it's a similar thing, and I think laws are probably always going to exist. Unless society collapses and we go back to hunter-gatherer tribes and we fight amongst ourselves or whatever. In a large-scale society, or even in like tiny little direct democracies like Athens, there are laws, and because there are laws, you need to make laws that are as just and as that treat people as equal as possible. And I can accept that these things are arbitrary somewhat, and I can accept that it's always aiming for you're always aiming higher than you're ever going to get to. But if law is going to exist, then I want the law to be as close to that ideal as is humanly possible. And I fight on that basis. But because the alternative, I guess, is just to be purely Machiavellian about it. And I don't really accept. I don't accept that interpretation of politics. I think it's too
Yeah.
simplistic.
So, like, the aspiration you're painting is something I'd be sympathetic to, but I guess I'm acknowledging that other goals that somebody I could like the ideals of, it could be not in conjunction with it. So I guess an example would be like if you wanted the laws to be representative of the community, but I think I don't know if you consider the United States a community, and then 52% of them were in favor of something that I just don't think should be a law. I'm kind of okay for somebody I'd vote for to go out of their way to make sure that doesn't become a law, right? So it's not just that like the vague idea of a just law isn't a bad idea, but I care much more about the people who represent me being in power than I do for that ideal because I don't even really think that ideal is reachable. So if I was to prioritize it, I'd have to sacrifice something. And things I would have to sacrifice would be much higher than what I would get, which is a just system, but it's just in the way you're describing it, which isn't even something that I'm ultimately happy with because I don't necessarily agree with the majority of the community on all kinds of things. Um, so I think the Machiavellian outlook is the only outlook I can honestly adopt. Because the other ones, it's just if I adopt your outlook, I have to sacrifice more, and I get something that may be more just in the sense that we're using it right now, but it's not necessarily even the society I want. And if you were in a society where most people disagreed with you, so I know that you might be a little more representative of the popular wisdom in America than I am, but if you put yourself in a society that didn't have your sensibilities, I don't think you'd fight for the law in a pure law in the way you're saying it now. Like, luckily, we have certain Western values that even if I disagree with them, I don't. I'm not. It's not like everybody wants to murder people, right? For outrageous things. But you could have in a way, a just law that is representative of the community's values. But it does mean that if somebody crosses their street at 11:30, knocks on their neighbor's door and tells them to quiet down, a just law and that community's standards could be you slice that guy to pieces and feed him to his kids. And you and I would both be like, well, I don't think that's fair. But if we're not representative of the community, then the just law for that community could be that, right? But that goes against your values. So you'd rather the person who represents you in that government doesn't go towards that. You'd rather them go towards the thing you agree with. And the sacred law isn't so sacred once you don't really care for the community's values in that way. So maybe that's why I'm not that sympathetic like you are to law, because I don't really like what my community thinks.
Um, well, I'm just being. I think my thought process is just far too platonic, or not far too platonic, but it is like I'm a couple steps removed from everybody else because I'm thinking very abstractly here. Um, but I'm not concerned with the United States of America if that's a community. I'm concerned with community. I'm concerned, and this is why I think we have a struggle, or we struggle to talk about the social contract because my I have a very niche interpretation of the social contract, which is not necessarily a common interpretation of the social contract, but I think it's the best interpretation of the social contract, or I think it's the best argument in favor of the social contract. Um, you know, so my again, I see the rule of law just as a community's values, and you could say, well, different communities therefore have different values, therefore they're going to have the rule of law is going to fight for different things or punish different things. I mean, that's true, yeah. I mean, this is why I'm like, I've taken the anthropologist's cultural relativism sort of outlook to heart. People in, so we just had off air. We were talking about Afghanistan and having conversation about that, and it's like, well, the Taliban obviously has a very different set of values than I do, and so if they base that on Sharia law, then you could say that's a rule of law, but it might be a rule of law that I don't disagree that I would disagree with. Excuse me. So I kind of lost my train of thought, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is I want to be. I see immense value, even if I'm a sort of a solitary person at times. I see immense value in being part of a community, and I see immense value in fighting for my values within the community. And so that is why I have a more positive interpretation of the rule of law. I mean, I'm becoming more and more, I guess, upset with or distant from, I guess, sort of the average, the thought process of the average American. So I guess I can recognize feeling in conflict with your community, but that doesn't invalidate my desire and ultimate need for community as the social animal that I am.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm just gonna real quick. I kind of want to just push you on a little bit more though. So it's so law is community's values in the ideal, but if that community has values you'd find abhorrent, the way we're talking is we're implying that there's a choice between the Machiavellian nature of going against community values to pursue what you want the law to be versus institutionalizing what the community values. Now, I'm saying use the politicians to go against the rule of law to change things so it's more like how you think of it. If in a world with like, I give the example of the neighbor slicing you up or whatever, blah blah, and that being legal. In a world where that's legal, I'm not okay with it, and I'm okay with my official doing something Machiavellian that goes against other rules of law to change the way that things are enforced. Are you okay with that or not? Because I can't tell.
I'm okay with it when I think the opposite, doing the exact opposite, would be worse. Sometimes you can violate law on, again, for high. I mean, I said this at the beginning. Sometimes you can violate law for higher grounds, or higher moral grounds, or just for making a broader point that I don't like this law. I want it to be abolished, and I'm going to do this. Like Henry David Thoreau, didn't pay his taxes because he was against, was it the Spanish American War, I think? And of course he was arrested, and Emerson, well, okay, that's irrelevant. But like, that's an example. He, I guess, bucked the rule of law. But he was bucking the rule of law because that was an example where the rule of law, he thought the rule of law was failing. So I am okay with going against the rule of law sometimes. But that doesn't invalidate, I think, the rule of law as the ideal that I'm fighting for ultimately. I mean, you can't get away. You can't get away from. I don't think you can fully get away from sort of being in conflict with one's community. The question is, if you're in such conflict, if you're in so much conflict that you just can't relate to anyone on almost any level, and you have to leave and start your own community or whatever. But I don't want people to like hear me talk about the rule of law, and therefore I'm somehow talking about like a bunch of automatons that wear the same clothes and think the same thoughts, and they just get along all the time and never have disagreements, and
unless that's what the community wants,
and are purely like any bit of individualism, I guess, in the good sense of that word, is crushed. That's not what I'm arguing.
Yeah, got it. I follow. I think, yeah. I mean, I only disagree on things that aren't worth going into, but ultimately, I think we agree. Given the, you just get to it in a different way than I do, but I think we're saying pretty much the exact same thing. Now, this actually wasn't pitched as a rule of law episode. It was pitched as a political tactic episode originally when we talked about it. So there is something that I wanted to touch on. I'm not sure how interested you'll be in it. I'm gonna monologue a bit, so bear with me. There is a movement in the ANCAP adjacent libertarian circle that kind of talks about practical politics. It's the people like Tho Bishop who want to co-opt the GOP and have a Mises caucus in the GOP because the Libertarian Party doesn't win any seats. And like, it's just this basic idea of why do we need to always be the losing party? Why can't we win primaries, win small community seats where those people have the most influence? And it's essentially just saying, hey, even if I'm an ANCAP, the best thing to get as close to my ideal as possible is doing something Machiavellian. And somebody from the outside can perceive you as being impure, but what you're really doing is you're really doing the best possible thing you could do for your cause, right? So it's this idea that it's the idea that I'm trying to get across, and this is why I kind of mentioned time horizons earlier in the episode, is you can do something that appears to contradict your values in the short term, or it appears to be compromising in the short term, but in the end, it advances in the direction of your cause, right? And this is probably something that could be why somebody could call Obama a more progressive president than like Joe Biden, even though everything Joe Biden is actually doing in the moment is much more progressive than what Obama did. The thing was, when Obama was president, the things he was doing, if you look at like how hard it was to get those things done, he had to push harder in that direction than Biden is now, even though it's very, I guess, like small government compared to maybe what things Joe Biden has done. So it's this idea that maybe some of the things that are in the short term appear to contradict your values actually are the things that make your values more organic in the long run. So that like philosophy of thought in my niche circle of libertarianism, a guy, he has a YouTube channel and a podcast called Popular Liberty. He puts it forth. He calls it archetropism, and he kind of points at certain types of behavior culturally that are more likely to lead to certain types of societal outcomes, right? So this is something that I kind of want to dig into, and I want to dig into cloud dynamics, and then I kind of in the back of my head at some point, once I digest that, I want to talk to Keegan about it, or I'm gonna have to talk to you into getting him back on so I can maybe pitch how those things work and how cycles interact with it. But I do think there might be something to the libertarians who are much more patient and composed and have settled down with their wife and they like really hate the state, but then they're like, what can I actually do? I think the actual thing to do could be to participate and then to do little things that might not necessarily seem the most libertarian because they set up libertarian things 10 years down the road. I'm not immediately opposed to that, even though I don't have the temperament to do that. I don't have the patience to do that. And I'm too done with the state to just like be able to engage with it in that way. But I'm not ideologically opposed to it. And I thought I was at one point. So I've kind of been feeling those thoughts out a lot. It's like it's just the long time horizon, I think, is what's left out of Machiavellian thinking, if that makes sense. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you can adapt any of those thoughts, maybe what you've been thinking about in the landscape that is policies you prefer. But that's been batting around my head a lot lately.
I mean, I think I would probably advocate if I were a Mises caucus type person. I think I would be advocating for the exact same thing. But this sort of reminds me of a question in like leftist circles. They have debates about like reformism versus revolution. It's like, do we try to make the situation on the ground better, bit by bit, or if you're a socialist, do we like get the socialism gradually through the state power, or do we just like take up pitchforks and like overthrow the government entirely and begin anew? And so I sort of go back and forth on this depending on my mood. I've noticed, because I actually think I'm becoming less interested in engaging and less interested in practical politics, because to me the system seems it's so broken, but also paradoxically robust, that the Bernie Sanders, I guess, wing of the Democratic Party say, I mean, they have had an influence. I can't say they haven't done anything, and I still can respect Bernie for what he has done. But at the same time, it does seem like that wing of the party is sort of like slowly acquiescing to the other wing of the party, the more conservative wing of the party, and they're less. People are kind of there are people on the left who are very upset with the Squad because they feel like the Squad isn't really holding the establishment's feet to the fire, and they're just kind of becoming traditional politicians that are sort of, I guess, conservative in the sense that they don't want to buck the status quo and they want to get along with their colleagues and they want to do these incremental changes that they think ultimately will lead to a better society. But I guess I do acknowledge that I mean, I'm not willing to die for the revolution, I guess. I don't think most people are willing to die for the revolution. Not that I'm advocating revolution, but I don't see the will to really like get rid of the system and start anew. So I suppose, given that there's no will to do that, there's no like, I mean, people talk about populism nowadays, but it's really a minor form of populism, and it's not a populism, again, that would be advocating for a new constitutional convention. People aren't picketing in the streets wanting a complete, change in the structure of government. And so if you see that, then I could see why someone would say, or if you kind of recognize that aspect of it, then I could see why someone would say, yeah, the best we can do right now is engage in practical politics, even if I don't want to, because it can get me to where I want to be farther down the line. So I actually don't think, I wouldn't say even the Mises Caucus type person would be contradicting himself. I think the only reason someone would say that, I guess, is if you have, if you take the ANCAP position, I guess, and sort of are suggesting that therefore you can't have anything to do with the state,
That's
to
like
be
the agorist view.
to be
Yeah.
the true ANCAP, you have to completely separate yourself from the state without trying to reform it from within the Republican Party, because then you're acting like a statist, and that's bad. That's not really. It's like a pure, it's like an ideological purity test, so to speak. But that's not really people. I mean, ideologies are never pure, and they're never pure because people aren't pure, and um,
I kind of want to muddy the conversation a little bit, and I think this will be fun because something we talked about a little bit before the show that we were getting fired up about. But I was joking with my friend about the stuff going on in Afghanistan, and I was essentially saying, I mean, I heard the Biden speech, and it sounds like he is not going to put troops back into Afghanistan. So that's awesome, cool. But I was joking with my friend that I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled when they pulled the troops out. You could do that with a neocon ideology, because what happens is, and this is something you and I have talked about a lot. I think people can be very moved by certain optics, or they see the seen but not the unseen, and certain things they would hate if they were in their face, but they don't. It's not in their face. So Biden pulls out troops. Afghanistan goes to hell in a handbasket in 3 days, right? There's like terrible visuals all over the internet. I'm like, wow, this is a really great setup for more neocon foreign policy, because the idea of pulling the people out in that circumstance, even though I'm in favor of it, perception wise, looks so bad that it's hard to believe that Biden isn't leaning back into it. Like, it's so politically unpalatable to so many people across all sorts of political spectrums that even though I'm glad he did it, it almost makes me worried that anti-war sentiment in the big picture is actually going to be hurt by this action, because the optics are so bad and they didn't take certain precautions and there was bad communications before he did it. So even though it's like in principle and because of my views, I agree with Biden pulling them out, the way he did it was so poor, it could hurt the overall cause. And that is a calculation that needs to be done for this is the whole Machiavellian nature I'm getting at in the long term. So it's like, okay, I'm for no troops being in really any place outside the United States. That's just my worldview and my outlook. Um, but with that said, if somebody comes in day one, pulls everybody out, and then the optics are look what happens, and you're throwing people softballs to spin it in a way that is misleading but true in a narrow sense, then you just sunk your cause for 50 more years or something like that. That's what I'm saying can appear contradictory, but might actually be the right thing for your movement. That's why ANCAPs can get mad at people who are GOP Mises Caucus people, which doesn't really exist for the most part. But it could hypothetically there could be circumstances where it's like, I'm not going to get rid of certain funding overnight, and it's like, because even though I know there will be a short term shock and it will fix itself, that short term shock is going to make me lose power, and then a leftist is going to come in and destroy the city forever. So the long term consequences, because this political apparatus exists, are actually worse for liberty. So I have to actually be somewhat, maybe slightly an incrementalist for 2 years, right? Something like that is something that I'm becoming more sympathetic to. Also, I wanted to bring up Jimmy Dore trying to push people to vote on Medicare for all in the House. His whole idea was, I want them to vote on it. There's a lot of Democrats, and the Democrats, because they're establishment hacks, are going to vote no, and I want on the record each person who's going to vote no, so the squad needs to force the vote. But I think this could be a situation where when he finds out this information, it might not actually cut the way he wants to cut. It might make people in the squad look bad, or it might undercut their establishment power, which unfortunately they do kind of need to some degree. So if they do force that vote, but then lose any power at all in terms of with the Democrats, they might as well exile themselves to the Green Party, right? So that might actually be a really bad idea for Jimmy Dore's cause.
I mean, I guess then we agree on this as well. I mean, it is it is about to change something, I guess, in the sphere of politics. Then it is a game of you know, I guess figuring out what you want to do right now, and then figuring out, you know, what will this policy look like in the future? Will there be a cost to me in the future? And sort of finessing it's a lot of finessing, right? There's a lot of contradictory forces you have to work with. And that's why I keep going back to, well, it's a little messy. And there was no one size that fits all.
But I do think these are probably, even though we're seeing examples that maybe I don't know the most about, I think the people in power should be able to game these things out well enough to actually make good decisions. So when people essentially armchair quarterback from Twitter and they say, how dare the Democrats not take a vote on this? Like those people should be looked at as binary thinkers. And you should be like, wow, that person is short sighted because there's more to it and there should be more to it. And I'm not trying to give the politicians cover. I'm really not. I think nothing of politicians. I'm just saying if that's the avenue that you want your goals achieved, then there are only certain ways to get there. And even though I don't think the Democratic establishment even really wants to get there, the alternative that people online suggest on Twitch streams isn't necessarily better. And it might just be shooting yourself in the leg or in the head, right? So it's like, why armchair quarterback when these are actually quantitative questions? Unless you can get more details or unless somebody puts out like a 15 post Twitter thread that's actually deeply nuanced, which I don't see happening very often.
I mean, I guess I agree with you, but I do want to add the caveat that at the same time, again, you can become so Machiavellian, or you become so like focused on either incrementalism or on like not actually Machiavellianism. Sorry, is the wrong phrase, but you can be so focused on like on worrying about like your geopolitical situation, or like so worried about ramifications, so worried about this, that, and the other thing, that you can end up you can end up hurting your cause in the same arena. So I think one of the reasons, I mean, there are multiple reasons that Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election, but I think one of them was she was like too afraid to take a stand because she was too afraid on so many of these like issues, or too because she was like afraid of like any long-term cost that she could like that might harm her in somehow, or might if she were to get elected president, she wouldn't get elected again because this, that, and the other thing. And so many progressives or many people on the left saw that. They saw that, well, she was like trying to be everything to everybody, and therefore they despised her, and they should despise someone for that very reason. They should despise politicians who act like that, because that's like, I mean, I know you're not a big fan of Bernie Sanders. No, I take that back. He's the biggest fan of Bernie Sanders I've ever met. But what I really do like about Bernie Sanders, I mean, he's kind of let me down recently, unfortunately. He's let a lot of people down. This is why Kyle Kalinske didn't get to interview him. We called him a cuck. But what I do like appreciate about Bernie Sanders, I guess, is I do think he both has political intuitions, but he's also willing to go for bat for principled reasons, or he's also willing to go to bat for things that he actually cares about, and he's willing to buck the establishment or go against the status quo for a higher cause, so to speak. And so that is really what I think you have to do. You have to understand how practical politics works, but you also have to have a guiding force, a moral compass, a set of values, a worldview. You're basing your policies on, and you're basing your decision making on. You don't want to be that person who gets into power who believes in absolutely nothing, but you don't want to be the people on the internet. And I'd say quite a few left-wing commentators might fall into this trap of thinking they're smarter than the politicians, thinking that like if they could get into certain seats, they would do all these great things. Then, well, actually, if they got in the seats, they would realize, well, you can't actually do as much as you think you can. This is sort of like Crystal Ball. Actually, she was interviewing Bernie on Crystal, Kyle, and Friends. That was the interview Kyle wasn't allowed to be at for whatever reason. But she was like pushing him back on, or she was like pushing Bernie a little bit. She was like Biden can do a lot more than he has done on various fronts, Bernie. And so it's like, why isn't he? Like he can free all nonviolent drug offenders. And he could do that with one pen swipe, and he's not doing it. Why isn't he doing it? And Bernie, to his credit, he was like, yeah, you're right. He can. But then Biden, like, because so Bernie was kind of like being two people in that interview, right? Because he was being honest with himself and Crystal, because he was like, yeah, you're right. He's not as strong as he could be. But at the same time, he's also slipping in that mindset of like, well, but like if you actually think about it, the president can't do as much as you might think they can do because of the whatever political costs are involved. All the chess pieces have to be in the right place on the chessboard, or it's not going to fly. And it's funny to see. I guess it's funny to see Bernie Sanders sort of split in that way. But yeah, you have to find a way to, I guess, have your feet in both camps, or I think you're missing the bigger picture.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have to say something critical of Bernie, obviously, because that's my role in the show. But I mean, I think the reason why he is able to be such a fan favorite is because when he didn't openly contradict himself on tape as much as other politicians. Because when he was in Congress, he openly had no power. He didn't like co-sponsor really any legislation in his whole career. If you like look at the things he put forward. He didn't compromise for short-term political gain at any point, or even for compromise for long-term political gain. He was essentially
He's
non-partisan.
compromising now.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So that's why you kind of mentioned like people are turning on him, and it's like yeah, because he finally has some influence, which means he actually has repercussions now. And this is like the criticism that Republicans who are neocons, but they have a facade of libertarian in them. One of the reasons why they don't like Ron Paul, who I mean, in general, when I hear him talk, I love what he has to say, is because he was so non-compromising and he was so principled that he essentially voted no on everything. Which, in a way, I can imagine a universe where voting for something you don't like could actually, in the end, have a net negative 10 years down the road for liberty. In which case, even though it seems bad to vote on like a spending bill, right? Because the government shouldn't do any of this spending, so I'm not going to vote on it. Well, you've made yourself a person who isn't even reliable on a certain type of bill. So now nobody's going to care what you say ever. And now you can't get any minor gain made. And like as much as I hate the Cato Institute for being incrementalist, the reason why I don't like the Cato Institute's brand of incrementalism is because it leans into institutions I think are dead. Because they'll glorify the rule of law in a way that you and I weren't willing to in this conversation. So they aren't even effective with their incrementalism. They're just saying we need to abide by this way these institutions should work. And also, I'm a squish. And I'm pretty much saying you can be a squish if in the long term you're actually doing the best you can for your values. And sometimes that doesn't mean acting like Ron Paul. Sometimes it means you're a squish on two things and then you get everybody towards liberty on other things. So yeah, I mean, I think you get that though. So I'm preaching to the choir. I think at this point for the most part. Do you want to give some closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so another name that constantly gets popped up or constantly gets brought up in this podcast is someone who's very obscure. His name is Noam Chomsky. You might have heard of him, maybe, possibly. And he like, excuse me, he gets like a lot of pushback from certain people on the left. Because it's like he's an anarchist, right? But then it's like you see him on some interview show and he's like, I voted for Barack Obama, I voted for Joe Biden, and then people like, people they look at his anarchism, right, and they say, well, Chomsky, you're totally like contradicting yourself, because you're an anarchist, so you don't believe in a state, but you're voting, which means you're tacitly or you're in some way supporting the state. It's like, how can you do this? Like, you either have to, be a statist and vote, or you be an anarchist and say, to heck with the system. And he's like, well, his response was, everyone's a reformist at some level, and so that's why I guess that's how he squares that circle. That's argument is still not convincing to some of his critics, and even I am not really sure where I fall on that line of argument. I'm a bit more critical of that reformist line than I was originally. But I kind of already gave the reasons why that reformism might be necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fortunate things about even talking about this stuff is it's interesting to think through, and it's a new lens of maybe criticizing people that deserve criticism, or to at least to some degree, maybe giving some people who do sometimes, as much as hard as to say it, deserve some sort of benefit of the doubt. Um, Being able to give some people a pass when they really do deserve it, because armchair quarterbacking is kind of stupid. But you need to acknowledge when being an incrementalist makes sense and when it doesn't. Now, fortunately for you and I, we're the most power we really have is voting. And as a person who doesn't really like where I live, and it's hard to imagine me living somewhere for like more than a decade, I don't even really care about the places that I can make the most, change, which is the most local levels, because I don't really plan on sticking around in a lot of those places. So who cares? And I don't think voting does much. So that's where I like this conversation, and I very much think it's a cool theoretical thing to bat around. But fortunately, like unless you're a senator, maybe it doesn't matter. I'm just trying to cast shade towards internet people who think they're geniuses, because I think a lot of those people think they're like, "Oh, I'm red pilled. I know the way." These people need to understand it, and it's like you're not operating in the political arena. Maybe these people are operating poorly, but you're analyzing them from an incorrect framework. So it's like you're even doing it wrong, even if they're still wrong. You have to think harder than that.
I mean, I think people probably, sorry to interrupt, but like people are still kind of thinking about the Obama era and his, like, he people thought he was going to be far more progressive than he was. I mean, and you said he was, based on, I guess, the opposition, he was still a pretty progressive president, but people were still very, very disappointed in Obama. I mean, rightly so, I would say, but because he did seem like in his rhetoric when he was on the campaign trail more fiery and more willing to go against the status quo. And then he got into power and became a typical center right Democrat. So I think the left is like afraid that the Democrats are always going to do this, or politicians are always going to do this, and so they're always railing against politicians. Don't make concessions. Fight for what you think is right, and come hell or high water. Because if you don't, then you just get squish the squishies you mentioned. You get people that just are not actually fighting for what they think is right.
Yeah, the way I look at it, since I come more from the right, is like I can imagine people like Thomas Massey making an unenforced error that gets people like Thomas Massey shut out of politics. So as much as I could hate moderate Republicans, Thomas Massey does moderate Republican things every now and then. But as long as he doesn't make enough unenforced errors to get stamped out of politics, then maybe there could be a few more Thomas Masseys in the future. And instead of me saying Thomas Massey should vote to end taxation every single day or try to introduce a bill, it's like, or maybe he should do the most palatable things that he agrees with that the establishment's afraid of, that the establishment isn't willing to squash him over. Um, but yeah, I like that we were able to touch a few. We were able to touch a few things. We've talked about the rule of law before, but it's been a while, and I think we did suss out a little bit of nuances there. And we've definitely mentioned Machiavellianism, but I wanted to get across that there's a tact of Machiavellianism that is maybe more comprehensive. Because I am sick of, I think this episode did come from my core, hearing like a lot of really stupid libertarian takes and hearing a lot of really stupid like radical leftist takes. And I was like, maybe they don't know that they want it. That if their ideas happened in the Senate, they would be shot down and dead, right? Because then you can kill your own movement by being the purest form. And yeah, I think that's a possibility. But episode 71. So there's 70 more episodes in our backlog beyond talking points on YouTube and any podcatcher. You can find Matt on Twitter at Matthew Whoa 8. So instead of an OD at the end of Hazelwood, it's
Matthew
Hazel Whoa.
Hazel. You said
Yeah,
Matthew
Hazel
Woe.
Whoa. God, I screwed that up. Yeah. So instead of the OD at the end of Hazelwood, it's an 8. So Matthew Hazel Whoa 8. Yeah. You can find me at Matthew T Keck. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I hope that's right. Because sometimes I think it's just Matthew Keck, and I think I say both all the time. But people can figure it out. I say things that are just like absolute, like something will hit me in the core in like a really weird way, and it's probably very obvious, but I think I'm making like some weird point that needs to be recognized. So you can see a collection of random points like that. I also Twitter's Space is pretty cool. I know I mentioned it to you off air, but you haven't really seen that in action. I don't know. Twitter is this cool thing. You can jump in, kind of chat with people. Every now and then, I'll be like eating food, and I'll join one and listen to what people are saying. And then, if you can grab the mic and just say stuff, you can have some pretty wild conversations on there. So, if people find me on Twitter, you might catch me in one of those. Arguing with some random people over weird ANCAP, anti-government, Bitcoin related things. Um, let's see, what else? You also host a show, Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. You've done 5 or 6 episodes going in depth into a lot of things that vary a pretty wide spectrum. So you can find more Matt's content there. He also has the YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher, where he's done some vlogs where he's dug into all sorts of things like why he hates white liberals, which I also have a distaste for. So if it seems like we disagree a lot, we do have some common ground somewhere in our heart of hearts. I also host the Obey podcast. Um, you know, you can find a solid backlog of rants that are very upset with how news is covered because we need more of that. It's not popular to hate the news at all. That wasn't a thing for like 4 years, but I like to think I took a slightly different angle at it. But I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. But for now, signing off is Matt and Matt. Thank you.